So question, I don't think this person was here last time. I thought I addressed it. Out of curiosity, what is your perspective on keeping chickens for eggs and having them consume food scraps? And would you own chickens? Yes, yes, yes. I have a chicken now, and I think it's absolutely great. I mean, again, if you have an issue, this is what's so interesting in terms of going back to Cowspiracy, why you might feel strongly about eating animal products. If it's an animal rights issue, then you probably would have a problem with that. But environmentally, I think it's quite good. As I mentioned, though, the problem is you really have to be productive to kill the chicken after a couple of years and replace it with new chickens, which you can easily do. But I don't really have that ability to kill our chickens. So yeah, it doesn't work out as well as it should. So Green New Deal is what we're going to be dealing with all week. First with the reading here, and then with the three little films we watch. And the Green New Deal, just so you know, this is the most comprehensive climate legislation ever actually proposed in Congress. It was proposed in part by AOC. What you're reading this week is the actual law that was proposed. You go into the House of Representatives website, you can read it. It's not very long. It's made to be understandable. It's like 12 pages long. It was proposed in 2019. It did not go forward, but it did have an influence on the Biden administration and the Inflation Reduction Act, which took some of its parts. But we're going to talk about it in detail. But since the films are also on it, I thought that this would be a good opportunity, today's lecture, to talk about one of the cornerstones of the Green New Deal, which is climate justice and environmental justice, and how these things work. So why this is a justice issue. So let me first jump here into our first iClicker poll. Oops. Let me see if I can go back to that. Yeah, so are you familiar with climate justice or environmental justice? These words sound alien to you? If so, say you're not familiar. Maybe you've had a class that touched on it before, either UCSB in high school or whatever, so you're very familiar with it. But I'm just kind of curious to know what kind of depth we're going to go into today with it. And I'm just generally curious as to what people know about things like this. You're kind of a nice cross-sampling of intelligent, educated folks. So let's see. Yeah, good. Yes, somewhat. So still 118 people are very familiar. So hopefully everyone will get something out of it today, but especially if you're in the B, C, or D category. So let me see if I can close this. Okay. So off to environmental justice. You've probably never tired of hearing. I mean, you're probably tired of hearing me say it, but we focus in this class on cultural changes, the kind of things that need to happen. Personal action is of course great, like raising chickens, but we need to do more, and we need to collectively address the issue. It's obviously a global problem. In different parts of the world, different countries have their own individual challenges with respect to this. So in other words, when I say it's just a cultural change, that sort of like it might sound like there's just one culture on the planet. In some ways there is, but in most ways not. We live in a very multicultural world. So the challenges that each part of the world face, and even parts of the US face, will be different. So I'm going to look at that in kind of detail. In the US, the challenge is, as we've seen with kind of everything we've watched, or a number of things we've watched in the second third of the class, things like Cowspiracy and the true cost, is that we need to enter a period of degrowth. How would you go about it? Henry David Thoreau had ideas, minimalists have ideas, but the idea is that, we have to figure out how you can have rich and meaningful lives and also reduce the size of our economy and reduce the population of the planet. And the reason for that, of course, is to make a serious intervention in the climate crisis by reducing greenhouse gas emission. But that is the challenge for the US. And again, We've seen people who are working out now how to do it. We're going to see another individual, Peter Kalmus, is a climate scientist who's really focusing on it, but minimalists are and all too. But anyhow, that's the challenge for the US to spend less, to be less than we are in certain regards, but still live happy and meaningful lives. It is very different from a wealthy country like the US or the EU to low and moderate income countries, because the challenge there is how to raise the quality of life for everyone. And that's often through like infrastructure, making sure they have electric. I mean, hundreds of millions, actually more than 1 billion people across the planet do not have access to electricity. Many people don't have access to fresh water easily. And the idea, same end game, so everyone there can live a rich and meaningful life while not raising their greenhouse gas emissions to unacceptably high levels. So for that 3 billion people on the planet that only contributed 5% of greenhouse gas emissions, they have to emit more. It sounds kind of contradictory because everything we're saying is we have to emit less, less, less. That is the case in the wealthy countries. But in others, it's going to mean higher emissions when they do things like get, fresh water to everyone, electricity to everyone, healthcare to everyone. But if we can do this sort of, twofold motion of us wealthy countries emitting less and those countries emitting a little more, it will all work if we come to a single average. Because of this, one of the reasons that COP21, people are sometimes frustrated by it because COP21 did not tell every individual country, 195 countries on the planet, how to reduce emissions, because every country has different situation, every country has different challenges. We have to think about degrowth, other parts of the world have to think about growth. COP21 said, figure it out for yourselves. That's a little frustrating because there's no enforcement mechanism in COP21, and this is, of course, otherwise known as the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015 at Paris. But, some things are related, like renewable energy will be a cornerstone of everywhere. So if we want to supply electricity to everyone, how do we do that? It has to be some type of renewable. Fossil fuels can't be in the long-term future of this planet. But other things are quite different. So I want to talk about those differences today. And again, to flip the takeaway here is wealthy countries use far less energy than we're using. We need renewables too, but we need less of it. Middle income countries, the challenge will be to use more energy, such as electrifying villages across the planet, but to do so responsibly and sustainably. And this is, by the way, a rub for some people in wealthy countries because many people want to think that we can figure out technologically how to get beyond this, and we don't have to change anything about our lifestyle or our cultural practices. So perfect example is an electric car. Electric car is just like a gasoline car in pretty much every way, except it has zero emissions, but you can still have this big luxury 5,000-pound vehicle and drive it around with just yourself in it. And the goal is, well, we'll continue to be allowed to do that, but it just won't work. It's just, now that the rest of the world wants cars too, there's no way that this can be sustainably done. If the whole planet just had cars the way the United States has cars, we have more cars than any other country, but if the whole planet had that level, the planet would be over. There'd be no way for this to be even moderately sustainable, even for the next few decades. Civilization on the planet would end. So responsibly, then we have to kind of think, how do we get rid of cars? We need to enter a period of degrowth in the wealthy countries and sustainable, responsible growth for low to moderate income countries. Both cases, profound cultural change. There's no way around that. You can't tech your way out of this. It has to involve cultural change too. Technology is great. EVs, electric vehicles, are absolutely terrific, but instead of, massive cars for everyone, we need to think about sustainable mass transit that runs on electricity, as well as personal mobility options like bicycles and all. I've said this before, but I'll repeat it, and you'll see why in this context. This course is taught in the U.S. will address problems that, to the rest of the world might seem kind of absurd. So here's an example. This course is considered reducing meat consumption, right? That's why we saw Cowspiracy. But in places like Bangladesh, and Bangladesh, by the way, was featured in the movie The True Cost, this is not an issue. Meat consumption, to show a film like Cowspiracy in Bangladesh wouldn't make any sense to anyone, because the average person in Bangladesh, per capita meat consumption is 4 pounds of meat per year. Some very wealthy people wanting a Western lifestyle will consume more, but the average person, if you average everyone out, it's 4 pounds per year compared to 265 pounds per year in the United States. So to put that in perspective, I'm going to do this with a number of things, or 3 things here today. People in America not only eat a lot more meat than people in Bangladesh, we eat 6,600% more meat than the average person in Bangladesh. So you can see just this one example, if you're looking at, planetary citizens, should people live? Person in Bangladesh, person in the US, 6,600% more meat. And this is a huge problem. And I'm going to lay it out when we get there in detail, but this is a justice problem and a huge one. It's difficult to imagine, I think, that kind of a difference when it comes to food. Nonetheless, the U.S. has a problem with people, not only eating too much, which impacts 40% of Americans, which leads to all these things like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes in a really big way, cancer. This is the easiest thing that we can do to prevent premature preventable deaths is to not consume as much food as we do. It's a problem, and especially if you focus in on the kind of foods that are problematic, like beef and other animal products, but beef especially, you can see where this is a problem. So that's the US problem. Our problem here is consuming too much of the wrong thing, especially things like beef. But I note here in the second paragraph, 1 in 10 people across the planet is experiencing chronic hunger every day. So returning to the example of Bangladesh, 40 million people are close to starvation in Bangladesh, 40 million people. And 40% of the country falls under 3 categories, which is hunger, starvation, and chronic hunger. So Bangladesh people are hungry all the time, large percentage of them. So we've also taken up the issue of air travel. So I'm going to compare the US and Bangladesh here too. Average person in the US takes 2.5 flights per year. You may take more. Half the population doesn't get in an airplane. Less than half doesn't get in an airplane in the US every year. But on average, 2.5. We fly quite a bit. And in contrast, in Bangladesh, just 1 person out of every 55 flies every year. So if you have trouble wrapping your head around the fact that the average person in America eats 6,600% more meat than the average person in Bangladesh, the difference in air travel is even more amazing, harder to imagine, as the per capita air travel in the US is 14,000% greater than in Bangladesh. So again, as a fairness issue, as a justice issue, this is a huge difference. I mean, these are like mind-boggling numbers. So car ownership, we'll take this as our 3rd metric. Hardly a problem in a country like Bangladesh, where only 4 people in 1,000 own a car. And by contrast, in the United States, 838 people in 1,000 have cars. In fact, we have more cars than we have licensed drivers in the United States. And to put this in a percentage, it's even more mind-boggling, as the per capita ownership in the US is 21,000% greater than Bangladesh. So if you look at these 3 things, and these are just 3, we could do more. We could talk about, owning other things and all, but a profound difference, 21,000% greater car ownership. You can see the problem here. It's a huge justice issue, and it's just sort of mind-boggling issue here. I'm curious what you think. Kind of taking it early on, but I'll take the next iClicker poll. How strongly do you feel about social justice issues? And again, this is anonymous. And there are a range of social justice issues. I mean, we're talking about it in an environmental sense. You might be concerned about, BIPOC communities, the LGBTQ communities, justice issues like that. There are a range of different ways to approach it. So I'm not asking here if you're concerned about it in any one particular way, but in general, do social justice issues, do they, or are they important to you? And the answer is, it seems like every poll in this class, those first two, if you put them together, over 500 people, and E, 10 people, not sure, D, people, 16, not very concerned. Okay. Oops. So all this brings us to the question of social justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. And these are all interrelated, and I'll talk about them. Those conditions under which people are forced to live in a place like Bangladesh is an example of a profound social justice issue. It would be, it wouldn't be quite one if everyone on the planet lived under those conditions, but the incredible disparity between wealth and low-income countries is just extraordinary, which is one of the reasons that we started this class looking at, the profound difference between the 1% on the planet and everyone else. Unfortunately, many of us in the room may be part of that 1% taken globally, and that's the difficulty. So 1% of 8 billion people is 80 million. Yeah, quite a few of those 80 million are people in the United States. Not everyone. We have 4 times that population in the US, but there are people who fit into that category here in the US, as much as maybe. Yeah, and I don't know exactly how many compared to other countries, but it's very high. Maybe not per capita as much as some other countries, but we do have a pretty large country for a wealthy country. So if we're talking about environmental damage done to a place where, like a factory that's polluting, that's what we call that kind of polluting point source pollution. Why? Well, because if you go to that factory, you can see if they're directly polluting the waterway, if they're on a river, factories often are, and they're discharging water into the river, that's the source of the environmental problem. That's the point source pollution. We call that environmental justice. But with all these, with social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, what we're really talking here is about injustice here. Why is this a justice problem? I mean, why isn't just a general environmental problem? Well, it is a general environmental problem, but those factories are often built on places where people are poor. That can be in the United States. It can be across the world. So if we're building factories to make clothing, we build them in Bangladesh because, well, labor there is cheap, environmental laws are lax, we don't care about that area. In the United States, why should we care about it? We're thousands and thousands of miles away. Of course, we absolutely should care about it, but the attitude is we just don't think about it. In Bangladesh, this is not only a personal choice where people would want to work in those factories, but why would Bangladesh as a country court these international factories to be built there? Why would they do it? Well, they, a very poor country, they need to have that sort of thing happening there. And if it hurts their local environment through point source pollution, they might make that kind of deal with the devil, because that would bring at least some level of prosperity, at least bring some international funds into the country. But anyhow, environmental justice is a specific point where the environment is being harmed there. We've talked about this, by the way, as a country and as a planet, really, for the last 50 or 60 years. When the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was formed, it was all about this. It came out of, in the 1960s, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and all that was making sure that polluters couldn't pollute in the United States. That made it tougher for businesses to work in the United States because you couldn't just, dump your waste into the local river, and it had to get cleaned up. That's generally pretty good for us in the US. There are actually, like in the 70s and 80s, Superfund sites that were cleaned up where there was a lot of pollution already. Unfortunately, what many businesses did, brands especially, is they just went to another country where they didn't have to worry about those kind of laws, where if there is an Environmental Protection Agency, it's far more lax. And again, why would a country allow those laws to be lax? Well, if they wanted to bring in international dollars, might be the only answer. Environmental justice is a little different than climate justice, because climate justice looks to how global climate change impacts people across the globe, with the poor being impacted the most. So, for example, because of flooding related to sea level rise, every year in Bangladesh, 10,000 square miles, that's about 18% of the country, it's almost 20% actually, is flooded, killing over 5,000 people and destroying more than 7 million homes every year. So let me just repeat that. It kills this many people. 5,000 people are killed every year, and 7 million homes are destroyed. And that's just on average. If you have a particularly bad monsoon year, and they have had those in Bangladesh, 75% of the country is flooded. When that happened, it wasn't, 7 million homes that were destroyed, but 30 million people were made homeless. So you can see Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Again, in this course, we focused on kind of at-home California problems like, wildfires. That's what that, documentary on the Paradise Fire, the Camp Fire in Paradise, California was about, and also things like atmospheric rivers. And during this very course, the last few weeks, we keep getting atmospheric rivers dumped on California, and we had it just over the past weekend, right? But if you're in a place like Bangladesh, wherever you are, the problems are different. So it's not just a little bit of sea level rise, but storm surge. When you have these large cyclonic storms, monsoons, or hurricanes in the eastern part of the U.S. or wherever you are, they can just bring in massive walls of water. In the places like the Bahamas and all, we've had storm surge and recent hurricanes of like 20 to 30 feet. So 30 feet is like as tall as, I don't know if it's as tall as the inside of this room, but pushing it. So you can imagine with a wall of water that high is pushed in by storms. If it happens to be, if everything is working against you, like high tide to begin with, and then with climate change, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and it's not minor like it might be in some other places. I mean, 5,000 people are killed every year because of it. This is a huge justice issue. It is profoundly, profoundly unfair that Bangladesh, who has contributed virtually nothing to the climate crisis in terms of their lifestyle, they don't eat a lot of meat, they don't fly very often, they have very few cars, they haven't really done anything significantly to cause this problem, and yet they are suffering for it. And that is a justice issue. And it's different than a point source pollution, because it's not like they're just factories are just polluting their waterways in Bangladesh, which unfortunately is happening. But it's also the case that here in the United States, where we have all these cars and eating all this beef and we're releasing all these greenhouse gases, they ultimately affect thousands of miles away. They affect across the planet, and Bangladesh included. So we've seen already there's this extraordinary gulf between the wealthiest and poorest people on the planet. It not only impacts the planet's poor directly through working conditions, and we saw that in the true cost, It does indirectly through environmental contamination, and that we saw, or that is happening in places like Bangladesh. And I use Bangladesh as an example because you actually got a little window into it through the true cost, but we could talk about any number of other countries that are the focus of international brands. So, and by the way, you probably know these. And what I mean by that, if you look on a garment that you have, for example, and you're trying to figure out where it's from, it'll tell you. So Bangladesh is certainly there. China was more than a decade or so ago, but China has gotten into more high-tech, sophisticated manufacturing. Indonesia is one. You may see labels from Vietnam. One of the new places is Ethiopia now, because Bangladesh has actually gotten a little wealthier and brands are going to where they can get things made the cheapest, and Ethiopia is kind of a hotspot right now. It's climate justice comes into relief because wealthy countries are just better equipped to protect their people from the impact of it. So I mentioned a number of times the Thomas Fire, 2017 fire that threatened Santa Barbara County here. And I mentioned, at one point there were 8,500 firefighters basically lined up protecting the city of Santa Barbara, all sorts of equipment. They had airplanes, helicopters, they had equipment from 10 states moved in. And it cost hundreds of millions of dollars to fight that. And they did, and they succeeded. And I'm very grateful. I live in Santa Barbara. They protected Santa Barbara, Goleta, Ventura, Ojai, and a number of other places. But how many countries could afford that? How many countries could afford, nearly, 10,000 firefighters and all that advanced equipment to do it? How many could? And depending on the challenge, how many can do the adequate preparation and defense given their particular problem? In other words, how does Bangladesh stop that storm surge? I mean, they can't afford to build, massive tidal walls around the whole country. It's just not going to work. And that's another example of environmental justice and a huge irony if you think about it. And so what I mean is, how did the United States get to be so wealthy? We got to be so wealthy during the age of the industrial revolutions, and there have been a number of them. And principally that was fueled by the fossil fuel economy. Early on, it was, burning coal that ran the factories and all. But then after that, we switched to oil and to so-called natural gas, methane. And that made us the strongest, wealthiest economy on the planet. All good, but all that contributed to the climate crisis. And now we have all that wealth that can protect us from the consequences of what we have done. But the rest of the planet doesn't have that. They haven't aggregated that sort of wealth. And if, on a personal level, if I had lived, anywhere other than Santa Barbara, the little wood-framed house that I live in Santa Barbara, that would have been burned to the ground. There's just no question about it. That's an example of climate justice, or in that particular, example, really climate injustice. So why is the problem? U.S., I've mentioned a number of times, put 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And we have that wealth that doing so gave to us. And, that will and is with the Thomas Fire, it is even with these atmospheric rivers, it's protecting us from what we have done. 30 million people made homeless by the last great flood in Bangladesh have little or no such protection. So it's a justice issue. It's a huge justice issue. In case you're curious about this, in 2018, Trump administration slashed funding to Bangladesh by 2/3 of the previous amount. And in the health sector, it was even great. It was reduced by over half during that. And let me explain that. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but I'll just tell you now as a first pass. Bangladesh does not matter a lot to the U.S. as a trading partner. I'm just saying that in terms of economics. If you lined up like our most important trading partners, not surprisingly, China would be at the very top. Where would Bangladesh fit in the 190 odd countries coming down? Bangladesh is actually at number 50. So what that means is, yeah, we don't care a lot about Bangladesh. We can slash money to them or not. They're not very important to us. If Bangladesh did the same thing and lined up their trading partners, as it turns out, number one is the United States. So when an American administration does something like dramatically slash the funding, it has profound ramifications to a place like Bangladesh. I'll talk about that more in response to a question in a little bit. So, what can you do regarding this? I mean, if this is a frustrating, seemingly untenable situation to you as a justice issue, yeah, you can do things like buy fewer clothing, but what about the social, environmental, and justice issues in places like Bangladesh? How do we address those issues here? How do we handle that? Well, the Green New Deal, which, by the way, I think is absolutely necessary and endorse it, is primarily focused on the US economy. This is a frustrating issue because, as we'll see, the Green New Deal, most comprehensive climate action ever proposed at a federal level in the United States. On the other hand, it's not adequate. So even if we could pass it, which we can't because we have such a divided country, it's still not adequate to deal with this as a global issue, because it doesn't. It's a very sort of nationalistic document, and it's only concerned about helping the U.S., what happens within our borders, and not the rest of the world like Bangladesh. The Green New Deal talks a little bit about that, but we'll see there, bigger issues here. And as a trading partner, what responsibility do we have to mitigate the sort of cultural problems that led to the Rana Plaza disaster? So Rana Plaza disaster, you saw in the True Cost horrific event that happened. What's our sort of responsibility in the US for something like that? Again, you can buy fewer clothing, but Bangladesh would like to make things for the world, but they would just like to do it in a way that would be less inequity involved, more justice. So being paid living wages, having strong environmental laws, that sort of thing. Okay. So the question is, in terms of environmental justice, should we play a role in making sure that countries like Bangladesh have strong environmental laws, which would prevent the production of stuff from the US and the rest of the world from destroying the environment in Bangladesh? And that's a question, and that's something that we generally don't. So the brands you may buy from, and with fast fashion, the brands that got a lot of attention, things like H&M, Forever 21, Shein, but pretty much any brand that you buy from that is not manufactured in the US, and things are not manufactured in the US. If you would have bought clothing 50 years ago, most clothing that you would have bought in the US was made in the US. That's very rare now. But what obligation do we have to those other countries? There is no international legal ramification to this. There's no obligation. So what I mean by that is, if a country, a brand, pick a brand, goes to Bangladesh to a factory and wants garments made there, do they have any obligation to ensure that, one, the working conditions there are good, that the people there are making a living wage, that they would get more things like, health benefits and all? Or do they have any obligation to make sure that point source pollution, which would cause environmental, devastation and environmental justice issues, has to be handled there? No, there's none whatsoever. And as you saw from the True Cost, there's really nothing that is being done. So that's a problem. And then the flip side, talk about climate justice now, not environmental justice. What happens when Bangladesh suffers because of the global, greenhouse gas problem, which we are the biggest main problem? Do we have an obligation to help Bangladesh? Do we sometimes? Yeah, Biden administration has given funds to Bangladesh on their problems, but how great is our responsibility there? There is no legally binding international set of laws that legislate any of this. This is entirely if a brand wants to enforce that, and if a country wants to help. Okay, so we're going to jump into our class discussion part next, and comments from this and earlier classes. From an earlier class, the statistic you mentioned regarding the loss of life and homes in Bangladesh, and it's astonishing. That's what I just told you. I was truly stuck by it. Paused the video and rewound it several times. This is from last year, to see if I heard you right. 5,000 lives lost per year, 6 million homes, and even in some cases. How could this be allowed to happen? My gut reaction was, why am I here learning about this when I could be there on the ground, actually helping those impacted by the flooding? Instead of caring about what these people face every day, we create false realities that benefit a wealthy few, and we call it good. I'm truly fuming, and I worry that this is a jumble of unconnected thoughts. It's not. Really, my takeaway is that the U.S. has no right to be considered a world leader, and in fact, in the wake of the Trump era, is not a world leader when we allow such events to happen and do nothing to avoid them. I think this is a great comment because, as a person here in the U.S., what is our obligation to these people, whether it's the climate justice problem with, as this person mentions, thousands of people, dying every year, millions of houses being destroyed? Is it an environmental justice responsibility of ours to stop the pollution that is, a consequence when, things we buy, like clothing, are manufactured there, and an environmental justice problem? Yeah. And it's only getting worse, I would add. So if you are mortified like this person, I hate to give you this take, but by 2050, the models are suggesting that 17% of Bangladesh will be submerged, full stop. Not talking about during storms, it's just sea level rise as it's increasing now. And given that Bangladesh is kind of low, is at a lower level, 17% of the country will go underwater. 20 million people will be displaced. And that's by 2050. It's not far, right? I mean, it's just a little over 25 years from now. 20 million people, we've talked about the idea of climate migrants. Those 20 million people will be climate migrants, and more than that, right? Because that's just the sea level rise itself, but the storm surges will continue to be getting worse. Storms are getting worse. Monsoons getting worse. Many more than 20 million people just in Bangladesh will become climate migrants. And, who does Bangladesh look to? I mentioned already, we are the principal trading partner of Bangladesh. What I mean by that, more of Bangladesh's exports go to the United States than any other country. So even though they play a small role in our economy, very small, as number 50 trading partner, we're huge to them. And I realize that prior to this course, you may not have thought much about Bangladesh, if at all. But it's being caused by wealthy countries like the US. In other words, when you watch something like, and I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating, the true cost, you might think, well, isn't that horrible for what's happening in Bangladesh, what's happening there thousands of miles away? But the question you should ask is, why is that happening? Who is causing that? Are the people of Bangladesh causing it? Are the people working in the factories causing it? Or are the brands that have gone there and set up shop and not paying people a living wage or giving decent working conditions and putting people in buildings that collapse and causing environmental devastation there? Who is all that? It's just something that we don't think about. We don't think about like where things that we have come from. And I would add as an aside, we don't think about where they go afterwards. So people buy 60 plus items of clothing in the US every year, and we throw them away after a year or two, if that much. We never really think about where away is, right? And where does that go? Because in many cases, away is that those garments will go back to other low to moderate income countries and become a problem there. I understand this person's comment, which is, to repeat it, why am I here learning about this when I could be there on the ground, actually helping those impacted? And first, it would be incredibly commendable for someone like the person who made this comment, to go to Bangladesh and to help with the suffering there. But honestly, one person going there, it's sort of like individual action here by, switching to a plant-based diet. It's small. It's a very small. It's not moving the needle much at all, and it's kind of a band-aid on a much larger problem. What we need to do is obviously significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because that model I suggested, by 2050, 17% of Bangladesh will go underwater. That's again being caused by wealthy countries like the US, or one of the principal sources, well, per capita, the largest principal source of greenhouse gas emissions. So one, we can stop that right off the bat. Two, we can reel in the free market system that we have that keeps making the US wealthier and is at the consequences and the suffering of other places. What I mean by that is, if it wasn't a system that was just dictated by the market, by companies themselves, if there were international laws established that every place had to be paid an actual living wage, that, benefits had to be made there and all, if strong, interconnected government legislation were to happen, that would make a huge difference. And the other thing, and it's really hard to try to sell Americans on this, but since we have all this wealth, we need to help the rest of the planet with the wealth that we have, that we've aggregated, and to help them to do something. And again, that's why we're talking about Bangladesh, far away. You'll probably never go there. I've never been there. But it is the case that to deal the most effectively with this would not be to go to Bangladesh and help there, although that is commendable, but would be to make significant changes to the way the US government and culture function, to take our responsibility for what we're doing there. Again, this is from last year. Ken posed various questions about whether the United States has a responsibility to help countries such as Bangladesh mitigate the social, economic, environmental disasters our country has caused. I just raised those, which is why I put this next. I believe that the U.S. absolutely has a responsibility to aid Bangladesh, other developing nations, and the rest of the world help the rest of the world moving toward a cleaner future. Over the past few years, especially, I've felt the sense of nationalism and patriotism in the United States has outweighed the compassion and empathy we should have for other human beings on the planet. This is a long comment. I'll jump to the second part of it. While people's feeling of pride for their country is great, I don't believe that it should be placed ahead of caring for other people in other countries. While America is focused on maintaining our strong economy and making revolutionary technology, medical, and scientific advancements, we fail to realize that the impact that our actions are having on the rest of the world. I believe the Green New Deal needs to include specific ways in which America can aid the countries that we have harmed, such as plans similar to the Global Marshall Plan created by Al Gore. And I put a little note here that was published in the year 1992, so 32 years ago. So I mentioned, the problem of climate migrants and all. If you think about what is happening with climate migration, it is bigger and is becoming bigger than any war that we've ever had. The numbers are already, we have 3 times as many climate migrants moving now as we do have people displaced by war. It's also the case that the changes that are happening, and these are things like sudden onset weather events. That's what we just had with these atmospheric rivers. Category 5 hurricanes are now exceeding that level, going to category 6. And in 2020, for example, Central America, which is having a huge number of problems with desertification, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and all, had 2 major storms there: Etna, which is a category 4 hurricane, and Lota, which was a category 5 hurricane briefly. Those 2 storms, and I'm giving another example now than just Bangladesh, one closer to home, impacted 6 million people and destroyed thousands of homes, displaced nearly 600,000 people in Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua alone. In addition, many people also lost their livelihoods. The Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Honduras, for example, estimated that 80% of the agricultural sector was decimated by those two storms. And it's this sort of symbol of the vulnerability of the problem. The other issue, one of the major issues here in Central America would be desertification. So in 2018 alone, there was crop losses for nearly 2.2 million people in that area and this is an area where like 75% or more people do subsistence farming. So we call that area now, and again, that's, that area like Nicaragua and El Salvador, the dry strip. And the reason for that or the dry corridor, because they have been experiencing this same mega drought that we've had in California, but I've mentioned before, they don't have the infrastructure or the wealth to be able to handle it the way we did. Right after Etna and Lota hit, and this was in mid-January of 2021, 9,000 people started a caravan to leave that part of the world because there was already, desertification happening where most people, lived with farming, subsistence farming. It's no longer possible. And then you had these two amazingly horrible Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes hit the area back to back. There was nothing left for these people. So 9,000 people formed a caravan headed to Mexico and the United States in order to search for more opportunity. And this was just the most recent event because this has been happening ever since the mega drought has been happening. Yep. So what that has shifted, and I'm leading to this as this larger political issue that this person was dealing with, that if you go back 10 years before that, 86% of people trying to cross the southern border of the US were coming from Mexico. 86%, overwhelming majority. By 2019, 81% were coming from the dry corridor, coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So if you ever ask the question, where are, a great number of people coming who are trying to get entry to the US from our southern border, they're coming from these countries that are experiencing the mega drought and these storms, which are both direct consequences of the United States or of our actions. And this person notes, and this is why I'm dovetailing it to that, over the past few years, especially, I felt the sense of nationalism and patriotism in the United States has outweighed the compassion and empathy we should have for other human beings on our planet. Feelings of pride for our country are great. I don't believe that it should be placed ahead of caring for other people in other countries. So in 2018, after these storms hit, after the mega drought's been going on for well over a decade, 9,000 people were trying to come to the United States because they had nothing left. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, called it a caravan. Let me see if I can give the exact quote. He said, "This is an invasion of our country and our military is waiting for you," the president tweeted. 5,000 troops were deployed at the border and what the Pentagon named Operation Faithful Patriot. So if you're wondering what this person is talking about with nationalism and patriotism, Operation Faithful Patriot was to turn that group of people around. And, the irony here is that region of Central America is one of the most vulnerable on the planet to climate change. In some ways, like what we're having in California, because if it's not droughts, these storms could be a problem. Although there, they get hit with cyclonic storms in the form of hurricanes in a way that we haven't generally in California, although that may be changing. But that group of countries there in Central America, the irony is they contributed less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. So they had virtually nothing to do with this problem. They didn't in any way create it. And the United States, which had the most to do with the problem, and instead of doing what this person is saying, that we need more compassion and empathy, the US, turned these folks around and deployed the military to do so. So, I mean, if you think about it, it's just a profound irony that we have closed our walls to people who are being harmed by the actions of what we've done. And unfortunately, this is frightening glimpse of what the future may hold. So you may have heard of the Arab Spring, that event, which was a 3-year drought in that part of the world, like Libya, and a huge number of people ultimately migrated from that area into Europe, and it led to the same sort of nationalist response that we have in Europe now, which is sort of echoing what's happening in the United States. And it does suggest that as this continues, climate change like this impacting these different parts of the world, and we're all over the world now, right? So it's not just like Bangladesh, it's in, Central America and all. There are going to be many, many more climate migrants, people who are so harmed by it that they have nothing to do. And to finally address this Al Gore plan, Al Gore realized this was a problem right after the U.S. really became mobilized with the climate crisis, where it became a national issue. Bill McKibben, who I hope will come to English 24 this year again, wrote a book in 1989 called The Death of Nature about what was happening with the climate crisis. Al Gore wrote a book 3 years later, and he introduced something called a global Marshall Plan. So if you know a little bit about U.S. history, there was something called the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. What was that about? There were a lot of European countries, including those that had started the war, like Nazi Germany, that were just devastated. They were just sort of bombed into devastation. So the United States came up with something called a Marshall Plan, and we said we should give money or lend money to Europe so that they can rebuild. That would be necessary. And a lot of people were against it because people were nationalistic and said, why in the world should the United States give money to Germany after what they've done? But the Marshall Plan was designed so that it would help those countries get back on their feet again. In many cases, they were loans that had to be repaid and all. Al Gore came up with something that he called a global Marshall Plan, or it's often called a Marshall Plan for the Earth, that we should do just that now. Instead of turning away people from the dry corridor who are migrating to the U.S., we should be helping them because we caused the problem, or a big part of causing the problem. We should help them now as best we can. So before I jump, let me just see if anyone has questions in the Q&A, and that would be the Q&A question number 14. No, not yet. Okay, well, I'll just continue moving forward. And so next comment. In the a lot of the time, we Americans don't recognize how climate change isn't just an environmental issue, but a social justice issue as well. The Green New Deal does an amazing job, and if you read this, I think you might agree with this, an amazing job of acknowledging the social justice issues that have arisen as a result of climate change. Americans are going to countries in the Middle East and fighting these wars in order to secure oil. While fighting these wars, they're ruining the conditions of innocent people who live in war zones. It's disheartening to see the measures Americans are willing to go in order to secure oil. This is why, just as Ken said, it's important to vote for candidates that are willing to put our climate first, since these issues aren't solved. Since if these issues aren't solved, we won't have a future on Earth. If candidates see how important the general population use the climate, they will begin to support pro-climate legislation such as the Green New Deal. Yeah. And I think it's right what this person says, and I'll address the previous issue in it, but if we keep sending a message to politicians that this is a priority of ours, they will respond. And AOC and others responded with the Green New Deal. Bernie Sanders had an even more comprehensive Green New Deal. You can still see it on his website even before that. So politicians will listen. You might think, well, they don't, but they will. But to this person's earlier point, in the past 30 years, the United States has fought two major wars. That was the Gulf War in 1991 and the Iraq War that began in 2003, and part of the world rich in oil. Hundreds of thousands of people died in those wars. Over 100,000 civilians died in those wars. arguably, what were those wars about? Well, it's one of the oil wealthiest parts of the world. It was about securing those oil supplies for the planet. It's just, and that's why this person notes it's disheartening to see measures Americans are willing to go to in order to secure oil. And you might think about something like, we talk about the cost of petroleum oil. In your general, we're talking about the financial costs, like how much does it cost to manufacture, how much does gasoline cost, things like that. But there are all sorts of costs to securing oil. And again, hundreds of thousands of people died in the Gulf War to securing the oil supplies and keeping the cost of oil low. And the Iraq War was the first one was especially environmental devastation because angry that they were losing the war, Iraq dumped 40 million gallons of crude oil into the Persian Gulf because they didn't want the U.S. and its allies to get a hold of that oil. And it created what was at the time the largest offshore oil spill in the history of the planet. And they also set, if you go onto YouTube, you'll see images of it. They set 700 oil wells on fire because, again, they didn't want the troops coming in to have access to the oil. So, we forget about this. You go to a gas station, you forget about the, extraordinary costs and how unfair it is across the planet that we have access to this oil. There are new kinds of problems with securing oil rights. So like in the United States, we actually generate a huge amount of oil. We're exporting oil, but we have to do that by way of fracking, hydraulic fracturing. And that creates its own set of environmental justice problems because the places where the oil and gas are fracked, people live there and it destroys, their often groundwater and other things like that. Yep. So it's interesting to think about in terms of environmental justice, and this person really focuses in on it. We tend to think of, like with climate justice, the back end of it. In other words, after emissions happen, so greenhouse gas emissions go into the atmosphere, it creates all these problems we're talking about, whether it's wildfires, sea level rise, storm surge and all. But even before it is even burned, we have to extract those resources from the planet, and that creates a whole host of problems, including, I would argue, two major wars. The only two major wars that the U.S. has fought in the last 30 years were about that, and the human cost there, whether it was destroying the place where people lived, where all that oil was dumped and all, or people actually just dying in the wars, is yeah, and it happens across the planet. And it's not just during wars. So, for example, if you were under the impression that Middle East is where most of the oil is in Africa, so you might think that, Egypt or Libya has the largest reserves of oil, you'd actually be wrong. In Africa, the largest reserves of oil are in Nigeria, and it's the main producer in Africa. And it accounts for 90% of all exports in Nigeria. It does not, however, translate into wealth for the people there. You might assume wealth with Nigeria, 90% of their income is coming from oil, and they have all this oil more than any other place in Africa. But the average per capita income per year in Nigeria is $2,400. A little over $2,000. It's in part largely because of corruption in that part of the world, and it's in part not just because of the corruption of the government there, but it's the companies going in to extract that oil. So many of these are U.S. companies, things like Exxon, Chevron, and Shell are there. So in terms of environmental justice and climate justice, it's huge all over the planet. I'd also give a little plug for one of my favorite TV shows, Ted Lasso. It has a character who is from Nigeria, and they in that show they bring up this issue. So I just think it's great. I'm always trying to figure out how you communicate problems like this. Well, even in a fun show like that, they address really tough issues. Next comment. The US is really internally two separate countries. The wealthy and the privileged and the poor are primarily BIPOC communities. That's, of course, Black, Indigenous, people of color. We have two different experiences in the US, with the former oppressing the latter. Although the US has outlawed segregation, and although we have relinquished many of our imperial territorial possessions, it is clear that these power hierarchies are still in place, and it's very clear that they are. The histories are impossible to ignore, both in developing nations like Bangladesh and in minority communities right here in our cities in the US. It's disgusting. The environmental movement has to be intersectional. Solutions offered like electric cars are only for the privileged global elite. When Ken mentions that only 4.4% of Bangladeshis own a car, I want to scream, it's all so unfair. This is why I like the Green New Deal. Its authors acknowledge these inequalities and focus on addressing them. Different communities will have different solutions to climate change, and we will kind of rely on those in power to understand the reality and work to simultaneously fix climate change and fix the systemic issues with how the country treats the poor. Yeah, no, I think it's a really wonderful comment here, because I've been kind of bouncing around across the planet, focusing on Bangladesh for a while, focusing on the dry strip in Central America for a while. But now this person rightly says this is everywhere across the planet. We saw it at that very first reading we had about the 1% and all. People are talking. So we really need, as this person says, and I've said it before, but this person did such a strong, articulate job of communicating it, really to deal with the intersections of where these things happen. These are intersectional issues. It's not just an environmental issue. It's not just a climate issue. It's also a range of other justice issues. So one thing we could have to do in the United States right away is end coal extraction in the US and dramatically downsize the aviation industry. Both of those would be huge. So, I mean, if you think about it, if people stop flying, that industry has to get downsized. We stop extracting coal, that industry has basically to go away. The problem is, like, the air industry alone directly employs like 500,000 people in the United States, and indirectly a whole lot more. So what's going to happen to those industries? What's going to happen to those people? Millions of lives are going to change and could potentially be devastated. So the Green New Deal, if you're wondering why it has these clauses in it, to take care of, to do things like provide long-term unemployment benefits, free education, guaranteed health care. It's acknowledging that when these changes happen, there are people for whom these would intersect that could become a huge problem. Your community may go away if you're in a community that relies on coal. What's going to happen to that community? It could be devastating. But the Green New Deal takes the position that we have to make sure we provide for everyone. First, with education, retraining, moving into other industries, also making sure that you have, healthcare, basic things provided for and all. It's a central part of the Green New Deal, and it's why I'm talking about justice issues in terms of the Green New Deal, because it's just a big part of it. If we make these changes, the problem is it potentially is going to impact people in a very detrimental way. And as this person notes, more often than not, one of the big communities that are going to be hit by will be BIPOC communities. So, the solution is to try to figure out a way of addressing these social issues and equity issues at the same time. And if we don't do it, we're just going to continue on with the inequality. So in other words, if we make subsidies to provide electric cars to people that are really wealthy, that's just going to continue the problem. It's going to continue the inequities, rather than if we do what the Green New Deal says, which is to provide mass transit, and much better mass transit, and provide that for everyone. That's a solution that will work. If you think it's like a huge job, it is, and it's one of the reasons the Green New Deal is so daunting. It absolutely is. But on the other hand, here's an opportunity to address deep-seated, very long historically, very long pervasive inequalities throughout the United States and the world. Here's an opportunity to address them all at once. And it can be done because they are intersectional issues. And yeah. Okay, so this is our last one. Are you keeping up with the weekly readings? I'm going to check on this every now and again. Okay. You can answer that. So what we're going to do on Thursday is actually continue with the Green New Deal, but looking at it directly. So this was sort of a setup to understand the justice issues that it addresses. But if you get a chance, watch those little films. You have to watch them all. By the way, all of the Q&As, or all of the comments are open now for the rest of the term, and they have the proper dates on Canvas. Ah, good. Most people are generally keeping up.